Welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. Everybody thinks they know the Beatles, but how much do we really know? My name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And this time round we are going to talk about Beatle books about the Beatles. This is an extra podcast that we're going to give you because some of you may be going away on holidays, maybe to a cottage in the Isle of Wight.
If it's not too dear.
Exactly, that's a Beatle reference there. And so, Stephen, you've got a large collection of Beatle books.
I have one or two books.
Exactly. So we are going to try and give you some choices that might help you read your Beatle books by the pool this summer. Stephen, I think it goes without saying that you are the person I know with more Beatle books than anybody else.
I think that's my claim to fame. I'm happy to accept that title.
Okay, fair enough. And so in the preamble to this, I gave Stephen a list of headings and asked him to kind of go into his Beatle library and choose the books that he thought would match the headings. So we're going to look at best overall biography. That's got nothing to do with Mark Lewison. We're going to go with best factual research book, best Beatle book with an arcane topic, best book about a solo Beatle, best book by a Beatle, and the Beatle book to avoid at all costs. But Stephen, can I ask you, your foray into Beatle literature, did it begin when you were a Beatles fan or years after you were a Beatles fan, or what did you do?
It began, I think, when I was at school, so I was maybe 13, 14 years old. The first book I can remember buying is by a chap called George Tremlett, who I think has probably written more books than anybody else. He seemed to sort of churn out the Paul McCartney story, the John Lennon story, the David Bowie story. That was the first book I picked up when I would have been about 14, 15, little paperback
so
book.
These are kind of 70s kind of...
70s,
Pulp Fiction.
I have to say, sort of Pulp Fiction, kind of trashy, cheap cover, give you the basic story. And that really is what piqued my interest. So that's the first book. A book which I lost somewhere along the way and recently rebought for 10p.
Well, nothing goes missing these days.
Nothing goes missing these days.
eBay it and bring it back to life. And is that, so are you reading about the Beatles in parallel with listening to the Beatles at the same time? Or
Yes, very much. I discovered the Beatles off the back of a collection of oldies. So I was buying my way into the catalogue while reading that book, and then that took me on to another book and another book.
It's a gateway drug.
It's a gateway
drug.
Once you get started.
Now, it is a huge... when we were kind of preparing for this, there are so many books about the Beatles, and Stephen has even put a book in front of me today by Erin Torkelson Weber, which is The Beatles and the Historians, which is a book about books about the Beatles.
You can never have too many books about the Beatles.
And what does this book about books about the Beatles tell us that we don't know already?
Well, it's actually, it goes beyond books, and it talks really about the sort of historical development of the Beatles story, about how they perpetuated the official narrative, when that started to change, the competing narratives from John and Paul in the early 70s, the anthology and post-anthology, and McCartney sort of trying to reclaim the legacy. And she also looks, which is I think a very pertinent aspect, is the bias, the inherent bias of one particular author or another author, that one is a Paul fan, the other is a John fan. No one's much of a Ringo fan writing these books, but and how that bias sort of, you lose historical objectivity. And she's coming at it very much as an historian.
And there's probably, when you talk about books about the Beatles, there are two kind of elephants in the room that I think we'll talk about briefly and then put aside maybe for another day. One is Ian MacDonald's Revolution in the Head book, which everybody loves. Do you love Revolution in the Head? I love
Revolution in the Head.
I don't think it's as great as everybody thinks it is.
I think it was such a refreshing take, because it's for people that don't know it, it's a breakdown song by song of the background to the composition, the recording, puts everything in a sort of cultural context as well. So I mean, it was just such a comprehensive, in-depth look at song by song. It's still a book that if I go on holiday, I take a copy of the paperback with me.
Just in case.
Just in case I need to look something up.
Yeah, I found it's slightly more opinionated. It sort of sells itself as a factual book, and then there's an awful lot of opinion in it as well, which is probably where I kind of, maybe that surprised me when I read it first. And then the other elephant in the room is Mark Lewison, and obviously I'm assuming if people are listening to this podcast, they know who Mark Lewison is, but if you don't, he's probably the is it fair to say, the eminent Beatle historical scholar of our time?
He is. I think he's carved out that niche. Yeah.
And if he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. But I think as fans, we've a lot to thank Mark Lewison for, and he's almost kind of formed a style of book by himself, starting off with his very factual 80s books.
Yes, I mean, he started off with the recording sessions, really is the book that most Beatles fans would know him. There are actually quite a few books, The Beatles Day by Day.
That was my first entry book.
The Beatles, there's a sort of a diary, there's various editions of that, but really there's a sort of forensic approach, where if there's anything that you want to know about the recording session, he will have it in a book somewhere.
Yes.
And he's also, I think, one of the few people, perhaps the only person that's had access to every single note committed to tape by the Beatles.
Yes, and he spent a number of years inside the Beatles/Apple camp before being unceremoniously removed.
Yes,
probably at the Harrison camp insistence. It's not. That's an open secret. It's open.
I think
knowledge,
I think he would say that it was really George. There was an unfortunate incident where he, having got approval to do an interview with a journalist, the interview then turned out to be less about Mark Lewison and more about sort of the anthology project and what was hidden in the vaults, and that was seen as a breach of trust, I suppose. McCartney, I think, very much in his camp, but yeah, I think Harrison.
And Lewison, of course, has published the first of what he says are going to be 3 volumes of kind of the ultimate Beatle historical biography. So Tune In came out, was it 2014 that came out?
2014.
And volumes 2 and 3 are due to follow, but Tune In, which is in its expanded edition, is 2,000 pages that covers up to the release of the first Beatles single. It's detailed.
It's very detailed.
And it's a fantastic book.
It is a fantastic book, but perhaps not the book to start if you're new to the...
Yes.
But it is, I think, the last word.
Yes, it's designed to go on a shelf and be the one that's definitive for many years to come. So poor Mark Lewison is active on Twitter, and people just constantly harangue him, when's the next volume? And he realises it's his life's work, and it's going to take it as long as it takes.
I think he said at the time 7 years. He was going to publish them at 7-year intervals.
Yeah.
So
TikTok,
it's due. I mean, I'm concerned I'm not going to make it. to get volume 3.
It gives you something to hang on
Can
for,
I say,
though, isn't it?
volume 3 will come out when I'm 64.
Really?
You see what I did there?
There you go. So it's all part of a plan. It all makes sense. So, as I said, I've tapped Stephen on his huge knowledge to look at some headings for Beatle books. So let's start with number 1, which is best overall Beatle biography, open brackets, non-Mark Lewison, close brackets. Which ones would you highlight or recommend?
Okay. Well, there are quite a few. The first one was the authorised biography by Hunter Davies. Really only goes up to about 1968. The first all-round biography that I'm aware of is the Philip Norman Shout, which came after Lennon's death. He began writing it in the late 70s, but it came out. And at the time, it was very much regarded as, a new style of rock journalism, rock biography.
It's kind of hard to believe now that there's like the 70s didn't have any kind of definitive Beatle book statement. Yeah,
I mean, there were little sort of scraps to say that George Tremlett book I mentioned. There were books that dealt with sort of individual records and things like that, but no sort of all-encompassing biography. That said, I think the reputation of Shout by Philip Norman has diminished quite a lot in recent years, and we'll be kind of touch on that a little bit later. There are quite a few contenders, but the book that I would say is Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould.
Yes.
And I think that, because it's written from the point of view, he's an author, but he's also a musician. So he's looking at different aspects. He's looking at the sort of the biographical, the chronology, but he's also bringing a sort of musical critique to what they're doing. It's a book I've read once or twice, not read it in the last couple of years, but it's certainly the one that I would recommend people go to.
And I have to admit, this is a book I've had on my shelves. It came out in 2007, I think. And I was given it as a present, and it sat on my shelves ever since, and I didn't read it until 2 weeks ago. You told me you should really have a look at that book, because sometimes I feel, well, I kind of know the story, and I think it's about 700 pages. I checked yesterday, it's on Amazon. It seems to be out of print, but you can download it for Kindle for £4. and it is a super read. It's really, really good, and it gives you all the biographical details in terms of this was their mom and this was their dad and this was where they went, and then they released the records in this order. But yeah, it plugs into it. It's very strong on what was happening culturally around the Beatles as they were growing up and when they were the Beatles.
That's what I like about it. Yeah, and that's where I think distinguishes it from the Philip Norman book, which was really the big biography that preceded it. This, I think, almost is a challenge to the Philip Norman book, which was very biased, very opinionated. This book really gives almost equal billing to all four of the Beatles. It recognises, obviously, the importance of John and Paul as the songwriters, but it's the start, I think, of the kind of pivot away from the Beatles were all about John Lennon.
Yes.
Which really followed his death in December 1980. And I think this is the book that, 26, 27 years later, before you start pivoting away from that narrative that John was the Beatles to all intents and purposes. There's not a lot of new interviews in this book, but he works very well with the existing sources.
Yes, that's true. There's a lot of he actually tells it in a very narrative fashion, and there's not a lot of we cut to Pattie Boyd and she said this. Yeah, it's very much telling us what's happened and what's happening around them. But he's basically a great writer, which is obviously a really important thing when you're reading a book.
I was going to say he is a fantastic writer. Yeah, and some of the books, the Philip Norman, Ray Coleman, they're journalists. They write like journalists. Yes. This guy has a very nice writing style. It's a very engaging style, and it's a very well written book.
Okay, so Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould is the best all-round biography. Any others on the short list? I know you were talking about Peter Brown's book earlier.
Peter Brown, he has a book, The Love You Make. He, for those who don't know, Peter Brown was sort of inside the Apple organization.
He is named on the Ballad of John and Yoko. Peter Brown called to say,
"You can make it okay.
You can get married in Gibraltar or Spain." So he's a lyric.
He is
as well
a lyric.
As a man.
He is a lyric,
and he's still alive.
He's still alive. He's still around. This is the only book written by a lyric, is what you're saying. Yes. But yeah, he wrote this book. It's a good read. It's a slightly salacious read. He's dishing the dirt slightly, more than slightly, on the inside story. Did not go down well with McCartney. I think McCartney tells a story where he and Linda, having I think cooperated to a degree in knowing that the book was coming out,
he did, yeah,
received a copy of the book, and I think as Linda said, they burnt their copy of the book. So I couldn't recommend it. For a little bit self-serving, yes. He puts himself at the center of things, but I think almost anybody that has entered the Beatles' orbit in at any point in their career has written a book. Yes. And obviously it's written from their perspective.
I read that book about 30 years ago when I was surprised to find it in my local library, and I was like, oh, a big book about the Beatles. And yeah, I do remember it's kind of the book that, if I recall rightly, opens up things about their behavior in Hamburg and kind of gets into the whole drugs and hanging out with prostitutes and all that kind of stuff that perhaps hadn't been driven home previously.
Yes, and I think it also, the individual Beatles don't come out of it particularly well, so they sort of highlight McCartney's character traits, and it buys into that narrative that McCartney was the pushy one, McCartney was the one that the source of friction. So I can understand why McCartney didn't like it. It's an interesting read, yes. But in terms of historical accuracy, I'm not sure that I would entirly recommend
as a
it.
starter. Okay, so Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould. Get it on your Kindles or wherever you get your books. Okay, best factual kind of research-based Beatle book.
Okay, I know we said we mentioned Mark Lewison and Tune In, and you mentioned his earlier book, The Recording Sessions, and I still find it hard to go past that. Yeah. Just for factual information, say this is a man that has heard everything that they ever recorded. He's painstakingly gone through every tape. If you want to know what instrument was being played, if you want to know where they were on a particular day, this is the book.
Yeah. That was a pivotal book for me personally, because I got it when it came out. I was a teenager and I didn't even have a quarter of the Beatles albums, but I read this book and it actually fed into me going off and listening to the albums in a certain order. Yeah. And it's an amazing book. And the fun part is, like up until 1966 doesn't take up that many pages. And then after 1966, there's obviously pages and pages and pages of information. And I've dipped into it now for over 30 years. It's extraordinary still.
It is, and I think that's the phrase. It's a book to dip into. It's not a book to sit down and read all the way through from cover to cover, but it's ideal if you're listening to the records. You want to know who's playing the guitar on a particular track, or what instrument they're using. This is the book.
And this is kind of something we mentioned just at the top of this podcast. Is it defined a type of book didn't exist like that before, to my knowledge.
No,
and there's now similar books for other bands, Kings and the Stones and all that kind of stuff. Here's their day-by-day recording studio diary. So he created a whole niche. And I know he has said in the years recently that since he's been revising for the biography, that he feels the recording sessions book is way out of date and he wants to rewrite it, and there's loads of mistakes in it and all this kind of thing.
I think that's the thing. He's also said, tune in, there are things he wants to change, and I think that it's a testament to the depth of research that he's constantly churning up new things. So you think he's produced a definitive work, he thinks he's produced a definitive work, and then something else would appear. Of course, the one question that you and I want him to answer is,
will he come on the podcast?
Will he come on the podcast? The other question is the Ballad of John and Yoko.
Oh yes.
Who was Yoko present at that session?
It's yes, we think not.
But it's inconceivable that she wasn't, because she and John...
That was the height of their...
Yeah, they were inseparable.
I know.
So if Mark is listening...
Yes.
or if Yoko is listening...
she might get in touch.
She can
phone us. We don't have a hotline, unfortunately. It's a great book, and I know there's certain things that are missing from it. I know people are kind of obsessed that the Shea Stadium dubbing session is missing, and it doesn't go into January 69 maybe well enough, and all the rest, and there's a whole books about that kind of thing. But I still think it stands up. And... it's got a fantastic McCartney interview as a forward.
As a forward, yes.
Like this fantastic 12-page McCartney interview, which is, he kind of talks about things in a way, he's more open than he had been maybe in other 1980s interviews. It's
quite a relaxed approach to the interview. Yeah.
And he mentions his favourite song is You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, which I don't think stands the test. I mean, I love that song. I don't think he still calls it his favourite Beatles song.
No.
Any other factual or research books that are on the nearly ran list?
There's a book called Some Fun Tonight. This is a bit of a specialist book. This is by a chap called Chuck Gunderson, and it's really the backstage story of the American tours in 64, 66. It's 2 volumes. It's really a coffee table book. It's just got a wealth of information and just some amazing photographs. Again, not the book to rush out and buy. I think it's a pretty hefty price tag on that now. He self-published it, so it's pretty hard to get hold of. The other one, which I suppose counts as a factual book, is You Never Give Me Your Money by Pete Doggett, which is really the story of the sort of financial relationships between the Beatles and Apple, and particularly covers the split and the financial business issues around there. That's an interesting aspect of the story.
And so let's move on to, say, books by the Beatles, because each of the 4 Beatles have released various different types of books by themselves. Is there one book with a Beatles name on the cover that is better than the rest?
I would go with George Harrison's I Me Mine.
Well, you would.
I would, but I know that's not what you want me to say. What you want me to say is Many Years From Now by Paul McCartney.
Yes. Is it really by Paul McCartney? It's Barry Miles and Paul McCartney. It's the closest we'll get to a Paul autobiography.
I think it is. It's effectively an official biography.
Yeah.
I think it is based on interviews that Miles did with McCartney over a number of years. Barry Miles, sort of influential figure in the late 60s swinging London underground scene. I read that Miles agreed to split the royalties.
Okay.
Paul needs the money. That Paul got 75% of the royalties, Miles got 25%.
That's still an okay amount of royalties for a book that sold a lot at the time. That book was 97, wasn't it?
It was 97. So again, you see that in perspective. You've had anthology.
Yes.
The interviews go back sort of pre-anthology, some of them, but this is really, I think, the start of the McCartney campaign to re-establish himself as the cool Beatle. He was the
national treasure. McCartney starts there.
He's really trying to counter that narrative, as I say, that started after Lennon's death, that Lennon was the Beatles and the others were sort of sidemen to Lennon's genius.
Yeah.
This is really the start of that campaign. all of the focus of the book is pretty much on the Beatles' years. He goes through virtually every song that I wrote 10% of this, John wrote 20% of that. That's slightly annoying after a while, but it is quite telling if you accept and if you recognize this is McCartney telling his version of the story.
And obviously, Ringo hasn't really done an autobiography. John never lived to do anything. He did an awful lot of autobiographical work, but didn't actually do an autobiography. George's I, Me, Mine, I have to admit, is a book I have never read. And does it really count as an autobiography?
He sort of does the same thing as McCartney in the Miles book, that you get all the lyrics, you get handwritten lyrics published, and then he gives you little bit about each song, where it was written, what it was about, what the context was. It was a very exclusive edition published while George was still alive. It's been expanded since. With additional lyrics. It's a beautiful thing if you have the hardback reissue. I think it probably does count as an autobiography. Ringo has a couple of books, most of which start off as limited edition signed by Genesis Publications, with books of photographs. There's a very sort of charming book that he put out called Postcards from the Boys. That's a lovely thing. Yeah. If you want to pick up a kind of paperback edition of that, where literally it's reproductions of postcards that the other Beatles, that seemed to be quite a thing, that they all sent him postcards from wherever they were, and he kept them all. Bless him.
And George's I, Me, Mine. John didn't like George's I, Me, Mine.
He didn't. Supposedly John took offence because he felt his influence or his contribution to George's work and career and had been downplayed, and that he railed about not being mentioned in the book. Now, that's not correct. I mean, if you read the book, John gets mentioned, Paul gets mentioned. This is basically a book about George's songs, so I don't know that John particularly should have been mentioned any more than he was. I mean, it's fairly accepted that, particularly in the latter half of the career, John not interested in George's songs. Those are the songs that he wouldn't turn up to play on. Yeah. He complained that they were overly complex. Doesn't appear on a lot of George's songs. So I think that's maybe John being overly sensitive. The timing is unfortunate because this happened just before Lennon was killed. Yeah. So there is this sort of rift that existed. There are some rumours that they did meet after that, but I don't think that's ever been verified.
And there's a book that gets forgotten about, which is the Beatles anthology book.
Yeah.
Which is an odd beast. I mean, there's a lot of reading in that, but it's a book that's kind of physically hard to read. It's massive. Yeah. And it's got a very odd kind of photo layouts and all the rest, and it's kind of difficult to read in a linear fashion. But it is the only official Beatles book about the Beatles with their name on it.
It is. I have to say, I will hold my hand up and say I'm not sure that I've actually managed to read that book.
I certainly haven't read it from cover
to cover. It's a coffee table book. You look at the photographs, you look at the little captions on the photograph, but it's not a book to read. And it's slightly anodyne. It's slightly sanitized. Well, more than slightly sanitized. It's a direct companion piece to the anthology TV series.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to Arcane Beatle books. I mean, I suppose it makes you wonder, with all these books about the Beatles, what is left to be said? What stories are left to be told?
Well, I'm hoping that you and I are going to write a book after the podcast about the podcast about the Beatles.
We could write a book about Beatle podcasts.
We could.
I believe we're not alone. But in terms of Arcane books with your Beatle librarian hat on, what kind of weird or wonderful things have you found?
Well, I think it is the case that anyone that met any of the Beatles at any point in the 60s or early 70s has written a book or is currently in the process of writing a book. So every member of the organisation, has written a book. The most arcane book is one that I resisted buying for a number of years, and I saw it was bargain.
You couldn't say no.
I couldn't say no. I mean, and this is a book called The Cutting Edge, and it's by a chap called Leslie Cavendish, and his claim to fame is he cut Paul McCartney's hair.
Wow.
In the 60s.
How many pages is this book?
Oh, it's a couple of hundred pages.
Right.
Now it's it's a relative. You could read this book in an afternoon. It's a relatively easy read,
yes.
but it is an interesting story. He was an apprentice in a hair salon. Jane Asher comes in. He the chap that normally did her hair wasn't there, so he is doing her hair. They get chatting, and she said, "Perhaps you'd like to come and cut my boyfriend's hair." And he suddenly realised, well, that would be Paul McCartney. So he ends up going to McCartney's house, cutting his hair. This becomes a regular gig. He starts hanging out with McCartney.
Oh, okay.
He gets going to Apple parties and things like that.
Do we learn anything outside of the actual haircuts? Like, it's not a chapter per haircut?
No, we don't really learn anything. I mean, the thing that surprised me is I was waiting for him to say, and I have all the hair that I cut in bags, but sadly not. But it's an indication
of the level that people will go to.
Yeah, and even more weirdly, people will buy these books.
Yes, they obviously know their audience. They know you well. You're telling me also about a more recent book, Riding So High, by Joe Gooden.
Joe Gooden. This was a great book because this is it's looking at the story from a slightly different angle, and it's a story that you and I know very well. You know the chronology, you know the albums. This is actually looking at the history of the drugs that the Beatles were taking. So from Hamburg and the kind of speed and that they were taking then to keep them on stage, through pot at the time of Help, onto LSD, onto sort of cocaine, Lennon dabbling with heroin. It's actually a fascinating book, and all the information is probably available in other books, but it's laid out in a way that sort of sheds new light on the story. And I think that's really the thing about these Arcane books is you get a slightly different take. You think you know everything, and then suddenly someone who is just there but was looking at it from a slightly different angle.
Yes.
If you saw the Good Old Frida documentary, which is Frida Kelly, who was the fan club secretary, which she did a film, I would like her to write the book. I would like her, that's the book I would like to read, because suddenly you see it from a completely different angle.
Yeah. Are there any other kind of people in the Beatles orbit who actually deserved to write a book? Are there any good books from because I mean, Epstein never wrote a book, Neil Aspinall never wrote a book, Mal Evans never wrote a book, and they would have had things to say. Well, I know there's a sort of autobiography of Brian Epstein, but that doesn't really count.
That doesn't really count. The book that I think was half written is the Mal Evans book.
Oh, right.
So supposedly,
does that exist somewhere?
There is a manuscript, a sort of half finished book that he was working on at the time that he died, and his stories, I think, would be fascinating, and I'm surprised that no one has taken the manuscript plus interviews that he gave and combined the two and produced a book.
Yes.
So I'd like to see that book. The other person that hasn't written a book and will never write a book is Jane Asher.
Yes.
Mark Lewison is saying that's the one person that he does not expect ever to get an interview with, and he sort of said, well, I respect her for that. So she's not spilling the inside information on her relationship with Paul, but I would say that would be a fascinating book. Yeah,
I mean, fair play to her for never really
going
down that avenue. I think so. That's understandable.
The other book I would say is The Longest Cocktail Party.
Oh, yes, I've read that.
Richard DeLillo.
Yep.
He was the house hippie at Apple in the late 60s, and that's quite an insight into that organization. And two other books by Derek Taylor.
Right.
I'm just throwing these out. No,
okay, just name every book you know.
As Time Goes By,
yes.
Which has just been reissued in paperback, I would recommend that. And if you ever find it in a second-hand shop, buy 50 Years Adrift in an open-neck shirt by Derek Taylor, because that's signed by Derek Taylor and George Harrison.
Oh, right. Very good. It's funny, you talk about people having these, very kind of tangential, brief relationships running alongside the Beatles. I remember there was a thing I read in Mojo a few years ago. I think it was Rodney Slater from the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, and he was in their orbit during Magical Mystery Tour, and he told this very small story that I just thought spoke volumes, which was he saw the Beatles getting their dry cleaning back and tearing the plastic off and throwing it on the floor, and he'd never seen anybody do that before, throwing plastic away in this kind of post-war austerity era, and that's when he realised how big and famous they were, when they threw their dry cleaning plastic in the trash. I thought there was a nice small story.
He should be able to expand that into a book.
There's a book right there in that day. We have, obviously, where there are books about the Beatles, there are books about the solo Beatles, and this is perhaps an even worse realm of books to try and navigate than the Beatle books, because the Beatles story, I think probably one of the reasons there's so many books about the Beatles is that it plays like a fantastic narrative. That's what people love about it. It has an arc, it has a beginning, a middle, an end. It is this kind of Dickensian group of characters and happenstances and things that happen that you almost wouldn't believe happen, particularly when you read the Lewison book.
It's the greatest story ever told.
It's a fantastic story. And then you get into the solo years and everything's it's a bit of a mess, and where does this begin and where does this end?
It's the slightly less interesting sequel.
Yeah, pretty much. But are there any solo books about solo Beatles that you think are worth the effort?
There was one book in particular that came out just a few years ago by Graham Thompson.
Oh yeah,
Behind the Locked Door, which is really the biography of George Harrison, and I think that I'm Team George. That's me.
I know. Although there's some things in that book that would put you off George Harrison as a person.
That's what I like about the book.
Yeah.
It sort of traces George's solo career, this kind of tension between, he was sort of very spiritual, but at the same time he did quite like the cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
And so
diplomatic.
It's the tension between those two, and he brings that out fantastically well.
Yeah.
And again, Thompson writes superbly. He's written other biographies. That's a book I would really recommend, that if you get through the Beatles and you've read those books and you want a solo, George was the best Beatle, start there.
Well, I have to admit, I went to that book after I read the massive 2,000-page version of Lewison, and unfortunately Behind That Locked Door was the book I read next, and you kind of feel frustrated when you get 50 pages in and they're already back from Hamburg and releasing albums. You're like, no, I need a good 2,000 pages on this. But yeah, overall, even because you look at George's career from afar and there seems to be years where nothing happens, and actually he fills in that space quite well. You don't kind of feel the gaps between late 70s to late 80s quite as much as, and he does go into kind of the handmade films thing a bit and all that kind of spin as well. So yeah, that's a good story to tell. Are there ones that you'd name for each Beatle, or are there ones that? Yeah,
well, I think for Lennon, there's a 2-volume Ray Coleman biography. It's an excellent book, and I think if you can find the 2-volume, there is a single condensed paperback edition, but the 2-volume version is the one to go with. There's Howard, I'm not sure, is it Souness or Sounds, how you pronounce it, Fab, which is, I think, subtitled An Intimate Portrait of McCartney. That's interesting because it actually goes all the way up to the Heather Mills divorce. It came out just after that, so there's a little bit of detail about that. It's a doorstop of a book, but it's a good book.
And I kind of feel there isn't really a decent McCartney biography, period.
Yeah.
I liked, what was it, Man on the Run?
In the 70s.
In the 70s. And certainly that covers up to the kind of the Wings Over America period. I kind of liked that styling. The author has just escaped my brain right now. But that's a super book, and there isn't really a Ringo biography of note.
There isn't. There are a couple of sort of generic. There's one came out recently, I think, called "With a Little Help from My Friends." But there's, Ringo has always said he's not interested in writing a book because all anyone wants to talk about are those 7 years. Those 8 years between sort of Hamburg and no one really wants to talk about.
Wait till he finds out we're not doing a Ringo podcast.
Wow,
we're not
doing a Ringo podcast.
Ringo's movies, that could be one. So I guess that kind of leads us on to books to avoid. And while we're on the subject of McCartney biographies, let's just talk about Philip Norman's Paul McCartney biography, which to my mind is one of the worst things I've ever put my eyes on.
It really is a terrible book, and I did warn you not to buy that. I've warned everyone not to buy it, but
I was bought it as a present twice. People think I'm easy to buy for.
I really have a problem with Philip Norman on so many levels. He was the author of Shout. It was really that first biography, very biased. It's a very opinionated book, very anti-McCartney. Harrison and Ringo barely get a look in. And
that's the interesting thing on Philip Norman's McCartney biography is he spends the opening section of the book talking about how he gains McCartney's trust, and how he wants to get to Paul, and he can't say that it's a sanctioned biography, but he's trying to play this card of you know, people think I hate Paul and I don't hate Paul, and Paul knows I don't hate Paul.
Yeah, but he
really
did. He did hate Paul,
and Paul's the best one.
Paul is the second best one. So, but he did hate Paul. He denigrates and reduces McCartney's involvement in Shout. Then he writes a biography of Lennon, which perpetuates that.
Yep.
He wrote obituaries for Lennon. He wrote obituaries for Harrison, which were quite scathing and quite sarcastic. Then suddenly he seems to have this epiphany where he realizes, I think, McCartney, I could do a biography there, and he starts, revising his opinion. So I don't like the opinionated aspect of it. There's something quite calculated about it. I also think he writes quite badly.
Yes. And there's errors.
It's riddled. Yeah. I mean, from the fact that everyone knows about Woodstock is that Joni Mitchell wasn't there but wrote a song despite the fact she wasn't there. He talks about Joni Mitchell appearing at Woodstock.
Yeah.
He, I think, refers to Denny Lane having been a member of ELO.
Oh God! Right.
Oh no! Sorry, the Incredible String Band, I think.
Yeah.
But ridiculous errors. And the most interesting fact about the McCartney biography is there were 11 fact checkers.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the thing I found, I mean, it came out relatively recently, and there's a massive chapter that goes into the McCartney-Mills divorce, and it feels that he's purely going into that in such an in-detailed way, because he can pull out the court transcripts, and he's sort of telling this very boring chapter about all the court stuff that goes on. You're like, oh, and like he'll skip over, half the 80s in about 10 pages, and then spend about 50 pages on what happened in the divorce courts. And it's
a book I would say recommend, and my recommendation would be avoid anything by Philip Norman. Yeah,
it's good if you've got a wobbly table or a door that won't stay open, then the Paul McCartney book is big enough to sort that out. Anything else on your avoid list at all counts?
Well, there's the Lives of John Lennon.
Oh yes,
the Goldman book.
Yes,
which was a bit of a hatchet job. Albert Goldman wrote about Elvis. He wrote about Lennon. That's a book that I think bears only a passing acquaintance with.
Have you read? You've read that book?
Yeah.
Because that's a book that I remember that came out in '88, and I remember vividly that was like a big cause célèbre at the time, and.
Cilla Black didn't like it.
Well,
that was the.
I remembered that there's that song on U2's Rattle and Hum, which they very politely call God Part 2.
Yes,
I know. I know you and U2 aren't the best of friends.
I'll take your word for that.
But which is literally a song, obviously in response to Lennon's God, where they take over what they don't believe in, and they don't believe in Albert Goldman, and they don't believe in his book, and it was like that was a big staunch thing that they needed to get out there.
It was, but I think Goldman sort of traded on that. He knew this was going to be a controversial book. He knew that Yoko, McCartney, he knew everyone was going to rail against this book, and I think I'm right in saying that he used the negative quotes as a selling point for the paperback edition. So that was the selling point. And
it's kind of disappeared for a book that was quite famous at the time, along with Spycatcher. Yeah, what else was read at the time? It's one of those books that kind of.
It's a book. It is. It's a book. It's a book that's, I think, despised by Beatles fans.
Yeah.
And I can hold my hand up and say I did not buy the book when it came out. I bought it secondhand. So Goldman no money went into the estate of Albert Goldman.
Yeah. It's interesting. And when we're talking about books today, there's a couple of books that I think are forgotten about, which. What's interesting is the Sgt. Pepper and the Beatles re-releases from the last 2 years. They come with books that stand on their own 2 feet.
They do.
Which I think need a bit of a shout out in something like this if people are sitting on the fence about whether to buy those box sets or not. But if those books came out as standalone Beatle-sanctioned 30 quid books, they would be an excellent buy. They are fantastic reads.
You're giving Apple ideas now, I think. But,
we had John Lennon put out his Imagine book last year, and that's the kind of book that could have sat in a box set, but it was released as a standalone type thing. And I think they are fantastic.
The Imagine book is a good book.
There's a lot in that as well.
There's a lot in that as well.
Fair enough. So I think as a general overview, have we missed any major players?
Well, there's 2 books
Yep. That don't fit into any of these categories.
Don't fit into any of these categories. There's one which is the Rob Sheffield book.
Oh yes,
Dreaming the Beatles. I think you and I agree that's the best.
We've mentioned that on our introductory podcast. Everyone should read that book while listening to this podcast.
Yes,
sort of a Mike Nesmith style.
It really is. It really is the most enjoyable book I've read in a long time about the Beatles.
Yeah.
You know, I tend to plow through these biographies, comparing one with the other. Completely different take. I really recommend it.
But actually, it's interesting because you know, if you kind of look at 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties up to today, you know, the different types of books that we kind of go from, you know, trashy biographies, then we kind of move into these very factual based books. Then people are kind of writing these kind of gospel-like overviews of careers. Now we have the distance, and now we're kind of moving into people just kind of maybe it's a sign of the times writing about their feelings or their thoughts or their, you know, their tangential inspirations related to things like the Beatles. So Sheffield's book kind of touches upon that a little bit.
I think so. It's a different style. It's a different take. The other book that I'd recommend is Beatles 66. By Steve Turner.
Yes, that's a super book.
That is an amazing book because effectively what he's done is just simply take a roughly 12-month period. But what I liked about that book is he quotes extensively from contemporary sources. So you've got interviews and news reports and reviews, because a lot of what you get inevitably is a sort of revisionism, whether it's, you know, I'm not really interested in hearing McCartney in 2019 talk about what happened in 1966 because he's got a story to tell, a narrative, an agenda to push, but actually looking at what happened contemporaneously in that year.
Yes.
The Turner book is a fantastic book, and I would really recommend that. I hope he's working on 65, 67, 68. But it is a fantastic book.
It's a great book because it fuses that, all of those kind of things, this kind of fact-based, narrative-based, timeline-based type storytelling. And as you say, he makes it very contemporaneous and plugs it into the time. And 66 is probably the best year to do because they change a lot. They record relatively little.
Yeah.
They've got lots of free time and space. And my favourite fact that I gained from Steve Turner's Beatles 66 book was that John, Paul, George and Ringo were the first 4 people in the UK to own video recorders. That they were given video recorders in January 1966 as a Christmas 65 present from Brian Epstein. And they were late getting delivered, so they arrived in January 66 and they were all wired up in their house. So they were the first people in England who were able to record things off the television and play them back.
So that's where McCartney recorded the Thunderbirds.
Possibly. Did he?
Yeah, well, that's my theory, was the yellow submarine in Thunderbirds is the same yellow submarine that they all lived in.
There you go. But it would have been black and white. You didn't think of that.
Well, I didn't think of that.
Sorry. Oh, there you go. You've ruined everything. Okay, listen, I think this is a very deep well that we can come back to a lot in the future in relation to Beatle books, but hopefully this will give you some ideas to go to your shelves or go to the shops. And we'll see you all next time. My name's Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And this is Nothing Is Real.